Welcome to the HTML5 Essential Training Series. I'm Mike King, your instructor, and in this tutorial we're going to talk about comments and whitespace in HTML. Comments in HTML, when you enter comments in HTML, the comments, they look like the following. What we're going to have is you're going to have a less than sign with the exclamation point, 2 dashes, and then the text of the comment in between, then 2 dashes and a greater than sign. And that's how we actually enter comments into an HTML document. Developers commonly use comments to describe their code. They make notes inside their markup so they understand the purpose of the markup if they were to come back to it, say, in a year to make changes to it. So we use comments quite a bit. We also use comments as we're looking to troubleshoot aspects of our code. Another common use of the comments inside of HTML is to mark out sections of the code as we troubleshoot different areas of our HTML markup that's not quite functioning correctly. We can actually pull bits and pieces of that document out with comments so that we're not losing the code, and then walk through it step by step to find out where our problems are. It's a common practice of web designers as they test out portions of a page as they want to temporarily disable a portion of the markup language itself. So let's go ahead into our development environment and look at some examples of comments in HTML. Alright, so let's drop into our development environment and look at some examples of comments. Let me go ahead and minimize this presentation. First thing I want to do, as we always do, let's confirm that we've got our Apache web server up and running. And we do. Good deal. Alright, now let's go ahead and bring up our browser that we're going to be using for our demonstrations. You'll notice that I'm in the root of our Comments and Whitespace tutorial. Go ahead and bring up my text editor. I'm going to be using Sublime Text 2. And real quick, let's go ahead and look at that document structure. Right now I'm in the Comments and Whitespace tutorial. I've got my image directory, which we actually used in the last tutorial. We're probably not going to use it this time. In fact, we're not going to use it this time. I'm certain of it. And this is where we're going to go ahead and store those documents we're getting ready to prepare for our demonstration. So the first thing I'm going to do is let's go ahead and bring up our exercise file so that we can see an example of comments. Alright, so I went ahead and loaded the exercise file. I'm going to go ahead and copy that example 1 inside the Chapter 16 exercise files. Let's go ahead and create us a new document in Sublime Text 2 or in your text editor. I'm going to paste my document in place. Let me make sure that my word wrap is on so that you can see everything, and it is. That's good. Now would be a good time to pause if you need to go ahead and type this into your text editor. And I will go ahead and scroll up so you can get the bottom portion of it if you need to type it into your text editor. And then we're going to talk about these comments that we have in this particular document. First thing, if you'll notice, let's go to the top. I'm going to go ahead and save this. Let's go ahead and save this as our basic template in the root directory of our Comments and Whitespace tutorial. I'm just going to call it basic template .html. It's going to be our HTML5 document. Let's go ahead and refresh our browser, and let's load that up into our browser window. And you'll notice here that I've got quite a few comments. In fact, we've been working with comments throughout our tutorials up to this point. But you'll notice I've got my less than brace, exclamation point, my 2 dashes, and then I've got a comment that says body content is inserted here. And we've actually had that in all of our tutorials. I use comments quite a bit to mark up my markup, which just sounds kind of funny, but that's basically what we're doing. We're marking up the markup as to where things go inside that markup. You'll notice, for instance, in this section, here's my opening section tag and my closing section tag. I've got a comment in there that says this is the comments section. The same thing, if you come below, you'll see another section of this HTML document that says this is the whitespace section. So in here we're talking about comments, and in this portion we're talking about whitespace, and I'm using comments to actually annotate inside my document that that's what we're doing with these areas of the actual HTML document. So I mean, that's pretty much all there is to comments. We actually use comments to mark up our code so that we know what we're doing in that particular section, and we can actually use comments if we want particular areas to be left. And a good example, or a way that we could demonstrate how we would mark out a section of our code, suppose I didn't want this white space area to show up on this particular tutorial, and that would be everything that's working right in here inside of our browser window working with white space. I could actually come before this H1 heading, put in my less than sign, put in my exclamation point, my 2 dashes, and then come down here right below that paragraph tag and close out that comment. So now all that information, when I save this particular document and refresh my browser window, we're going to lose all this text because it's now commented out of the HTML document as we were working through different ways to troubleshoot this particular code if we were having a problem with it. And a lot of developers use comment tags to do that also. So not only do we use comments to mark up the code so that we know what's going on inside of our code structure, but we also use it to take out sections of code as we're working through problems that we find as we're developing our pages. Not unusual to do any of that. And keep in mind that most of the pages that you're going to develop are going to be much more complex than the little examples that we're working with here. All right, so let's move in and talk a little bit about whitespace. So let's go in and talk a little bit about whitespace. Whitespace in HTML consists of additional spaces, tab characters, and return characters that allow you to separate the content of the HTML document to make the document easier to view. And properly aligning your text is a good coding best practice as you learn to develop your pages. So although whitespace does not affect the way an HTML document is rendered inside the browser window, it does take up space in the HTML file, as you're going to see in a minute. With that in mind, use whitespace to make your document easier to follow, but don't overdo it. It'll add to the size of the document, and on small pages that's not a big deal, but as you get into larger websites where you have large pages, that can become substantial in how long it takes that particular page to load. So let's go ahead and go into the development environment, and let's look at some examples of whitespace and how we use it in HTML to help us read and set up our pages. All right, so let's go back into our development environment. Let me go ahead and minimize the presentation. Let's go back into our development environment and look at some examples of whitespace that we're using. I'm going to go ahead and scroll down in this page a little bit. And you'll notice I've got spacing between my H1 heading, my H2 heading, and my paragraph tags inside this document. Plus I've also tabbed in. You'll notice that my sections are lined up. I've got my heading elements that are normally lined up. And I've got my paragraph elements that normally line up. So what I'm doing here is I'm actually nesting. And if you remember back to a previous tutorial, we talked about nesting tags. I'm actually nesting my heading 1s, my heading 2s, and my paragraphs inside my section element. And I'm using whitespace inside this document to nest it, make it easier to read, makes it easier for me to follow the flow, the document flow of how things are flowing inside this document. So let's go ahead and save that. You'll notice when I refresh my HTML browser window, even though these are grouped right on top of one another inside their section element, and I've got these separated inside their section element, they look the same. They're all appearing the same way inside my browser window. And I'm going to drive a better example of that home in a minute. Let's go ahead and open up a new file, an untitled file, and let me load in a new HTML document. Inside this new file, let me go ahead and paste this in place. I'm going to go ahead and save this. I'm going to save this in my root directory as example1.html. And I'm not going to have you type this in. There's really no need for you to do this because, believe it or not, this document is the exact same document that we just read. Let's go ahead and go back inside of our browser window. Let's refresh it. Let's load example1 inside my browser window. And you'll notice it's the exact same document that we had in the previous example. If I look at basic template, let's go ahead and reload the basic template. You notice I've got working with context. I got whitespace. In fact, I actually spelled whitespace wrong in HTML. Let's go ahead and put my A in there. Save that inside of our basic template. And you notice I've got the normal document flow. Everything seems to be working as it should be in this normal document flow. Save it, refresh our window. So we've got whitespace in HTML, comments in HTML. Now let's go back and look at the example document and load that up in our browser window. And you notice we've got that same misspelling. This is the exact same document. What I've done is I've taken out all the white space. If I want to go in and change that word, and I actually did that misspelling on purpose, you remember how easy it was to correct it in the other document. This one we actually got to dig through the document and find it because I don't have it structured well. I've taken out all the white space. I've saved the size of the file. This is actually what's called a minified file. We've actually taken out all that white space. We've made it a little bit smaller, but it's much more difficult to read. But again, displays the exact same way in the browser window, so it gives you a good example of how white space is ignored in HTML. One thing I do want to point out really quick, let's go ahead and save everything. I want to go back to our root directory for a minute, because even though these are small files, I want you to notice the difference in the size. My example1 file is exactly 1K, whereas my basic template, even though the pages are exactly the same, the white space has taken up 1/10 of a K, 100 bytes, more space than the minified example1 file. So it gives you an idea that even though white space is ignored in HTML, it does actually take up space in the size of the file. And even though these files are both very small HTML documents, there's 100 bytes difference even in the small document because of the white space. So it's something to keep in the back of your mind as you're designing your pages. If you get into some really large pages and you've used a lot of white space to keep things separate and organized and easier to follow, you may want to go back and take some of that out as you're loading your documents up, especially if you find that your web pages are slow to load. This concludes the tutorial on comments and whitespace in HTML. I hope you enjoyed it. It's part of the HTML5 Essential Training Series from On Target HTML5. And I look forward to seeing you in the next tutorial.